Brilliant. Cool. Are we live on Zoom as well? We are indeed. I can see people rolling on in. Fabulous. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds so that Zoom can catch up, and then we'll start going. So we'll just do an awkward filler, which is always great when you're British and nervous about speaking about things. Anyway, let's go. So good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for being here for day 2 of the Humans Come First Summit. It's really, really wicked to sort of be able to wake up and do it all over again. You know, I really, really enjoyed yesterday. There were so many lovely comments. It was a really, really top day. So we're ready to go again. And today, like, I'm thrilled to little tiny bits to be welcoming our guest, who is Sarah Roberts, who's the head of digital comms at CUH NHS Trust. Sarah is a Marketing Meetup attendee. She's also a Marketing Meetup speaker. And now we're adding the Humans Come First to the growing portfolio of impressive achievements, which I'd say there's probably quite a lot more on her list throughout her career. Sarah is responsible for communications across CUH, which is responsible for both the Addenbrooke's Hospital and the Rosary Hospital in Cambridge, England, both of which are recognised as world-leading hospitals. And of course, this being 2020, then there's a reasonable amount of focus on hospitals right now. So to have someone speaking from one of the best is really quite something. On a personal level, I've actually been a beneficiary of Sarah's work. So it's always quite nice when you see it out in the wild. And that's because my wife works at the hospital that Sarah covers. Quite regularly, she'll come home and sort of speak about the emails that she's received, which is really, really nice, but also the community spirit that Sarah and her team have fostered through their Facebook group, which no doubt Sarah will speak about later, and if she doesn't, we'll ask her about, which was established during the height of COVID the first time round. And without, you know, giving the game away or anything like that, Sarah's work has just been invaluable for creating a source of community togetherness and support for the thousands and thousands and thousands of staff that work at CUH. There's a couple of things that need caveating up front. You know, none of us are basking in I suddenly went very sudden there, basking in that COVID is happening. So I just want to say that there is not a single second that any of us wish this was happening, but the fact that it has given us an opportunity to explore something which is truly fascinating. And we're just really looking to find the positives here. Secondly, I'm sure, again, Sarah will caveat everything that she says with this, but this is her personal reflections and doesn't necessarily reflect the wider views of the Trust. I feel like I should say that, and it sounds like a Twitter bio, but I think it's necessary. Today's session has a presentation element, and then we'll get some questions in, and please do use the hashtag HCF Summit. And also a big thank you to our sponsors, who are AdRoll. They run a community for marketers, an online community for marketers, which everyone here can join today, right now, meet marketers, have some chat, have a really great time. And that's found at adroll.com/community. So I think that's my bit done. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. And thanks for letting me come and talk about this, because it's something that I think touches the lives of many, many people. So what I'm going to talk today a bit is about how we keep humans at the heart of our NHS COVID response. And that's really important that we do that. So first of all, I'm Sarah. Thank you for the intro. And I'm head of digital comms at CUH. What I really care about is making sure our patients have a great digital experience. I've got more than a decade's experience in public sector and comms and marketing, and I have the privilege to lead a team of 5 brilliant digital comms people through what is not arguably one of the most difficult periods of NHS history. But first, a little bit about the trust that I work at. So there's 11,000 staff, which in itself is it's a small village of people, and people who are working across all different types of departments. There's about 170 in total, so that's a far ranging, lots of different work going on there. Tens of thousands of patients receiving care in the hospitals across those different units. But there's this really interesting element about the combination of care and research. We're situated on the Cambridge Biomedical campus, which has access to organisations such as the University of Cambridge, AstraZeneca, GSK, so all these big research partners that enable us to do research and then implement that research, the findings, to improve outcomes for patients. So I think that's a really unique position to be in. From a communications point of view, there were 4 key challenges that we faced at the very beginning of this pandemic response, and they continue to be big challenges for us as we move ahead through what was recovery and now moving back into this position where it's starting to feel like it did back in March. So that's quite interesting. So although the pace feels a little bit slower compared to March, there still is this element of communicating at pace, and that's a little bit different, because when you have announcements that are happening in the evening, usually around 6 p.m, that where policy gets launched, you're then thinking, crikey, how on earth are we going to make sure that our staff and our publics understand how this is going to affect their job and how they are going to receive care at our hospitals? So that's always the top of mind whenever going into the daily briefings, even now. And although a lot of the issues that probably were issues back in March aren't issues now, for example, PPE, there's now manufacturing pipelines in the UK, which makes that not so pressured. There are elements which do come as curveballs and need to be worked through as from an organisation point of view. We also have a remote workforce, but also frontline, and keeping those connected is very, very important, so that we feel that we're all fighting for the same thing. We're all working towards the same vision. So that continues to be a very important part of our communications. We also have a big job to reassure patients as well, because in the first wave, we found that patients were not accessing the care that they needed to when they needed to, because people were scared, and people continue to be scared. So that is a continued response, that we have a responsibility to make sure that people do access care when they need it. And then managing the demand for our team. So the shift to digital very much placed a big burden on the team to help people navigate this new world of Zooms and Teams, and how do people gain access, how do people run events, and that very much fell to us to provide some leadership around that. And we weren't experts at the time, and we're starting to get there, but it was very much new territory for everybody. So it's not so much of an issue now, but continues to be one. How do we empower the organisation to be able to do this for themselves? So I'd like to firstly touch upon about how not to underestimate the power of the human voice. So our hospitals went from this in March, lots of people, there's no social distancing there, no masks, to this, completely empty corridors, which was, walking through it was incredibly eerie. But what it meant was that there was a visiting policy that got put into place that meant nobody could come and visit their friends and their family in hospital at a time when they were most vulnerable. And that was absolutely heartbreaking to do that. And it being the point, we had reduced the visiting down and down and down, but I'd never thought that we'd take the decision to stop visiting completely. And while at the moment we are allowing visitors into the hospital, it's a very real prospect for us to stop visiting at some points in the next couple of weeks. And that's something we're keeping an eye on. And the first time that we announced this policy, we put out this, which was very much aligned to the government communication response. Remember the green? Very much aligned to that, keeping consistent messaging going out. And we put this out, but what we hadn't realised is, for many people, this is really awful news and really emotional news, that you're telling me that I can't go and visit my gran in hospital when she's really ill and feeling quite lonely. And so we had a pushback, and it didn't land in the way that we originally would have expected. And what that did mean is that we had to think of, well, how do we bring more of a human element to our messaging? And so we released a series of videos using our people to be the voice of the organisation, to help people understand why it's important and communicate that. And you'll hear, this is Giles, one of our deputy chief nurse, and he, even in a few seconds of listening to this, you can understand, you get that warmth that does not come across it in that first graphic.
The reason that we've made this decision is to keep people safe and to save lives. Thank you for your help and support and understanding.
And so that means that even that small voice meant that people would understand the reasons why, and it was received in a much better way. And that's something that we're continuing to do, is to use our staff to be the mouthpiece of the organisation, to help people understand why we're doing things. And although COVID, I'd say probably for the last couple of months, hasn't been in terms of consuming our work as communicators, it's been kind of in the background and lots of other stuff has come to the fore, we've had the opportunity to take that approach and use it in different ways. So for example, here, this is Salvatore, he's one of our Italian nurses, and he had a live Q&A on Instagram where people could ask him any questions and just about the job and hear a little bit more about what they do and the pressures of the role that they're going through. So again, it's about bringing that human element to help people understand what's happening in the organisation. And you might have caught Surgeons, which was the BBC documentary, a bit gory, I must caveat that, where they followed 4 operations in hours and Royal Papworth's hospitals. And we had a live Q&A session with some of the surgeons. And again, it's about giving people the platform and using your trusted experts to provide information and that warmth and that human element to what can be quite clinical procedures. So that's something that we've been doing interim, and now we're kind of shifting a little bit more into the COVID space again. And so I was on call this weekend when Boris did his announcement on Saturday night, and so the Sunday was quite a busy day for me, because with the announcement again, it meant that people were wondering, well, what does this mean in, you know, as a staff member, what does it mean for me as somebody who might be coming in for treatment, and what does it mean especially if you're coming in to visit one of your family members. And so Charlotte, here you'll see, we've quote retweeted her. She is one of our ICU leads, and again, about amplifying the voices, the trusted voices in the organisation, that adds weight to messaging and adds that human element, where we need to quickly get messaging out. I mean, to get a video done on the Sunday and then out the same day on call would not have been possible. However, being able to use the voice of some of our people in that way meant that we could share that and make it a little bit more human to what, again, is quite hard messaging for people to hear. So some things to consider when communicating with compassion: where possible, have a human delivered difficult messaging, because you just don't know how it's going to be received. And so by having a human do that, it means that you minimise the potential for it to be misinterpreted. Keep it simple. Again, with emotional messaging, it's very difficult for people to absorb, and we know that it takes on average between 5 and 8 times for somebody to completely understand a message. So keeping it simple means that it enables people to do that in a more successful way. And also scenario plan, where I didn't think that it was possible for the visiting policy to completely ban visitors from coming to the hospitals. Think about how, you know, what is that worst case scenario and how could you make that just a little bit more human? And that's what we do more on a regular basis now. I'd like now to touch on the importance of connection and keeping people connected. So back in March, when we found that people were having to work from home, people who were not on the front line were asked to work from home. The infrastructure at that point was not set up and geared in a way to be able to access information outside of the network. So we stepped in to help bridge that gap in terms of launching a staff portal, which was available outside of the network. But also we introduced a staff Facebook group, which now has more than 4,500 members, which out of a workforce of 11,000 is a good proportion of reach. And so initially we set it up so that it would be a kind of a signposting exercise for us to make sure that people would receive the information, that really fast-paced information, so that people would walk into their job knowing what they needed to know for the day. So we had things like the coronavirus bulletin, the coronavirus message from the chief, and then you'll see the shift to the CUH bulletin where we made that conscious shift that actually responding to COVID is no longer exercise in itself. It is the way that the hospitals are working. And so that was a subtle shift. And then we found that people were sharing lots of wonderful content themselves. They were sharing thank yous, they were sharing those generous offers of donations, where that really community spirit was coming together. And that was nice because that wasn't us doing it. People use it as a way of being able to connect with others in their own way, which was really lovely to see. And we also used it as a way to share stories. So here on the left, this was David and his partner Joyce. Unfortunately, David has now died. But the fact that we were able to share his story of the chaplaincy team and doing everything that they could to organise a wedding for somebody who was in ICU, just absolutely heartwarming stuff that allows people to feel connected to the reason why we're doing all this. And we also have things like the 8:27, which is a very specific time for a meeting, 8:27, to allow you enough time to get to your 9 o'clock meeting. And that's now done via Zoom to the Facebook group so that people can get that up-to-date information from a human on that regular basis. And this is Maureen. I wanted to share with you Maureen. She just last week finished 55 years of working at the hospitals. That was her entire career, was at CUH, and just how amazing that is to be able to share stories like Maureen's, and celebrate and recognise the dedication of staff. And you'll see the response there with lots of people commenting and liking and sharing that. So it's that connecting people, but in a way that helps them to feel connected to the organisation and to each other. So starting a community, make sure we have a clear purpose for the group. Ours is very clear. We needed to get information to where people were, so via their Facebook accounts. And group rules, we don't have many rules. The one that I think is most relevant is if in doubt, leave it out, because it puts the onus and the responsibility onto the people who are interacting. And we trust these people to be able to cut people open and do incredible surgeries. So we need to be able to trust them to interact on a community with each other in a way that is appropriate. So we trust our people. Have some content lined up, so do some signposting exercises if you know that there's things that you can signpost to, and have content that draws people back to it on that regular basis. So the Facebook Lives, everybody knows that on a Tuesday morning we have the 8:27, so that's another opportunity for people to keep coming back. And empower your people to become self-moderators, because you never know when you launch a Facebook community how much effort that you as a administration team are going to have to put into moderating this content. But 9 times out of 10, when somebody puts something inappropriate, there'll be a whole host of people who are telling them that it's inappropriate. So people do become self-moderators, and thankfully we've only had a few occasions where we've had to step in and provide that, I suppose, more top-level administration, which is a very good position to be in. I'd now like to talk on the impact of stories. So Doug did a really good talk yesterday about stories. So I won't dwell too much upon sort of the structure of stories. But what I will do is talk about I suppose, how we use stories in a way that helps us keep humans at the heart of our response. So the reason why we share stories is primarily for 3 reasons. It helps bring hope when that national outlook is looking pretty bleak. It makes us able to reassure people who are understandably scared. You know, the fact of coronavirus and people knowing that people are being treated for COVID within the hospitals, that's a scary prospect when you think, actually, I'm quite vulnerable, I need to come into hospital for treatment. So our role is to help reassure people to feel comfortable at coming in. And also it helps people to understand what's going on inside the hospitals in a way that makes sense, not just facts and figures about, you know, how many people have contracted it, how many people are being treated, how many people unfortunately have passed. it allows us to share it in a way that people can understand a bit better. And so my favourite piece of storytelling throughout all of this was just after we came out of the second wave, we had the BBC come in and do a 12-hour shift with us, which was called the Inside CUH, and the live stream that the BBC did is now still available on their website, which is brilliant. And it was just filled with incredible stories that had been captured along the way of the journey. And behind that were two teams of journalists that were paired up with a digital communicator and one of our external affairs team, who helped to pull together all of those stories throughout the day. And this is Camwell, and Camwell is just an incredible person at our hospitals. And we started our day with her. She had probably the most normal day that she'd had in 3-4 months, and she was operating on somebody who needed a jaw reconstruction. And so we started the day with Camwell and we ended the day with her. So it was this lovely piece of storytelling across the day about what was happening in the hospitals. And we also got to meet patients such as Tim, who was there for an X-ray, and also Sue, who had come in for cancer treatments. And for those people who were feeling very scared, it allowed people like Sue to say she felt very secure and really well looked after. So sharing those stories of people undergoing and showing that people are still coming for their appointments, just again, social norming, that it's okay, that it's safe for people to do so. It was really important at that time, and continues to be, especially as we move into the second wave. So telling stories, make sure you understand what's important to your audience. And we knew that people needed reassurance about turning up. We also knew that from a digital appointment perspective, a lot of appointments had shifted from face-to-face to digital, if they could. However, not many people were understanding that actually the same resource goes into a digital appointment as it does a face-to-face. So it's still as valid and as worthwhile attending than a face-to-face. So there was a big part of that too. Find stories and characters who help you bridge that gap between where you know people are and where you need them to be. So your Camwells, your Tims and your Sues of the world help you to be able to do that in a way that is very different to an organisation saying, come to your appointments. What's your inciting incident? Ours absolutely was COVID. Where's that conflict and how are you resolving that? And also know when the story needs to move on. And this is a really important point. So you'll remember back in the first part of lockdown, and there was this such amazing feeling and togetherness, all this overwhelming donations. People were standing on their doorsteps at 8 p.m. every Thursday clapping for the NHS, and that was just an amazing time. And if you could bottle that up and open that at times when things are a bit gloomy, how amazing could that be? However, that could never have lasted. And so shifting the I suppose the narrative on from that was really important for us as an organisation, because we could never move into business as usual if we were focusing on it as a response to a pandemic. And things have moved into business as usual as a hospital. So everything that is happening now COVID has impacted that. So whether it's waiting times, whether it's people who are coming for face-to-face appointments, whether it's people who are coming in for digital appointments. And so moving that story on, and those very subtle shifts of changing the bulletin from coronavirus bulletin to CUH bulletin, from not referring to our staff as heroes, because it puts people on a pedestal, and it's actually about people doing an amazing job all of the time to help get us back to an even keel. So that's a really important point. And humans do need to be at the heart as we move forward in this. And so the impact of COVID has touched many lives from our hospitals. We've had people who perhaps are waiting longer for their appointments than we would ideally want them to. And that's quite a lot of people that we're talking about, and it's going to take a number of years to get back to where we were pre-COVID. And so within that, we need to make sure that we are putting them first and making sure that they are in everything that we do, the primary people who our communications are geared up for. So this is an example of a communication that's gone out to every single patient that is waiting longer than we would expect them to. And so it details for people what to do should their conditions worsen. And that's a very big undertaking for the organisation, because it's often we've had feedback from people that they didn't even realise they had an appointment and they'd completely forgotten. And so there's an opportunity to have a conversation about their healthcare there, and do they actually need that appointment. But for others, it's a reminder that, you know, that they are potentially living with a condition that hasn't yet been treated, and that also has an impact on them, their families, but also us as an organisation, as we want to do everything that we can for our patients. So as we kind of straddle this strange situation between lockdown and business as usual, we are being proactive and honest about the impact that COVID has had, and that's about us being transparent as an organisation. We also really want to understand what are those operational challenges that our staff are facing in terms of helping patients to get back in. Some services have managed to get back to an even keel already, which is brilliant. You know, from our bowel screening, we were the first in the country to turn that back on. But there's others which there is a big waiting list, and the impact on patients, in particular our staff's mental health, but equally patients' mental health from having to live with that is front and centre for us. And finding those stories that demonstrate recovery, and it's the people who don't realise that they are making a difference, they're the ones that we need to find the most. So when we were doing the BBC Inside CUH piece, there was this brilliant guy, Bill, who was in our cleaning team, who had this amazing robot that goes into the wards and would decontaminate everything. It's this fogging machine which covers absolutely everything in it takes about an hour and a half. And he operates this, he keeps everybody safe. But he didn't realise that actually he has a massive role to play in our response. And so he just couldn't understand why, as a team, we wanted to talk about him and the role that he does. So convincing those people that actually they do have a story to tell is very important too. So to summarise, don't underestimate the power of the human voice. It's incredibly important because it can shift what could be a very cold message to something that actually people respond well. Connect people, because often people don't have the means to be able to do that themselves. So what can you do to help facilitate that? Marketing Meetup is a great example of that. Stories are a really important tool in your armoury, and use them wisely and use them in a way that people understand and understand your audience as well, because that means that you can tell the stories that matter the most. And humans do need to be at the heart of the way forward. So just think how you can make your communications just a little bit more human, and that will serve you very well for the future. Thank you. You can connect with me here and here on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then back over to you guys.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sarah. You know, so this is, you know, I've heard a version of this talk before, but, you know, I feel exactly the same as I did the first time round, which is, you know, just absolutely astonished by the efforts of you and your team, really. I mean, this, you know, it feels like it matters, and it's, you know, there's comments coming in now sort of saying what an amazing talk, and there was a comment at the beginning about how it was the perfect way to start the day and a really interesting way to start the day. And I think it's, you know, without meaning to denigrate anything that any of us do on a day-to-day basis, this really feels, you know, important. And the way that you and the team have carried it has been, you know, simply inspirational and incredible. So, you know, I mean, I hope you feel like you get the credit you deserve as well, because, you know, it's a massive undertaking. So thank you very much for that as well.
So I I have to say as well, like this it's the first time like I've heard it or heard any of the work that you've done, Sarah. And I have to say, like as a B2B marketer, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is quite humbling, because of what you're marketing and the approach that you're taking to it. So like I think it's a perfect way to start day two.
Absolutely, 100%. So there are some questions, Sarah, and we'll stop embarrassing you now with with all the high praise and stuff like that. So there is a question from Dave here, who says he thinks your presentation is so fantastic and loads to take away, reflect on. So thank you. He asks, how did you manage the emotive effects of staff during the pandemic? And how are you able to keep those spirits up when they were understandably low at times?
That's the continued challenge, is how do you keep doing this? Because adrenaline only gets you so far, and our staff absolutely were running on adrenaline. In fact, we had somebody who we were asked, they had to self-isolate. That was the reason. They couldn't be in. They had to keep themselves away from the hospital. And I was just astonished at their thought behind it. So they felt that they were missing out on the action of the biggest thing that would happen in their career, and they were missing out on helping, on being with the team and helping. So there's definitely a big sense of camaraderie, but as I say, that only gets you so far. The organisation has done some amazing things to support people and to keep people's spirits up. So I mean, the public, the overwhelming support and the donations that came flooding in, we had to open up, for anybody who knows Cambridge and the campus that we operate from. We have a sports centre called the Frank Lee Centre, and this big hall was filled to the brim of just donations of everything that our charity, Adam Brooks Charitable Trust, had to figure out how on earth do we get this to people across the organisation. And so it was so varied. I mean, imagine Easter and all those Easter eggs. We had piles of them, of Cadbury's had donated all their leftover Easter eggs, you know. So there's so much like that. But equally, keeping a focus on mental health is really important, because the toll of coming off a shift, of wearing all that PPE and treating people in a way that probably you wouldn't want to, because it's not the way that you've done your job historically, that also takes the mental toll. So lots of support, and the neighbouring mental health trust has opened up a hotline for people so that they can access things like that. But equally in our communications, that whole part of the Facebook community was about sharing things that we knew that would help boost people's spirits. And as a communications team, you know, for us, the toll on us is quite a lot, because we were hearing things from the operational command, where we were having to go into the command structure and hear these, often, like I sat on the PPE group at times, it was hairy, it wasn't great, but the organisation was able to respond, and that gives confidence to people, that to know that they are in safe hands, and just the talent, both from a leadership perspective, but from across the organisation, to respond to this. It builds confidence, so that you feel that you are in very, very safe hands.
I love that. And how do you, and this is probably more of a personal, approach rather than a sort of a broader thing that we can take away, but how do you strike the balance between a tone of pragmatism versus one of positivity? Because inevitably the news is quite difficult a lot of the time, but you're also not trying to wear people down. Do you have a way of sort of dealing with that in your own head?
Yeah, I do, and it comes back to the why we're doing it. Always thinking about the why, so that we can put out messaging any time of day. We can put it into the bulletin, we can put it into our Facebook group, we can share it. But if we don't think about the why we're doing it, that can be very difficult for people to I suppose, to take on board what we're doing and get them to do what we need them to do. And there is that, I suppose, how do you keep people optimistic in this? It is very tricky. It is very tricky indeed. So I think from a personal point of view, from managing the team, it's about telling them the facts, and then looking, well, what is the good side of this, because it gives us an opportunity to work together as a team. So lots of people across the organisation have been doing after action reviews after the first phase, and amazing things have come from this. So listening to people and hearing what's important to them throughout all of this means that we can reflect that back to them in terms of how we deliver the messaging and how we deal with people. So we know that to people, PPE was a big deal, and making sure that we had enough, again, a very, very big deal. And now that's not so much of an issue. So where we can share the good news, we absolutely have to. And amazing things happen, business as usual, throughout all of this anyway. It was just yesterday that we had it's our You Made a Difference awards, and Michael in my team was one of 12 across the entire organisation out of so many nominations. He won it. Nice. He was the driving force behind the staff portal. He did it in like less than 2 weeks. He set this thing up that became a game changer in how we responded as a team. And so having these opportunities to be able to share what's really, really great, but equally be really honest about what's not so great. So it is a balance, and you can't often do it in the same message, but having that balance so that it's not all doom and gloom, being able to celebrate people who have done amazing jobs is just incredible. Big shout out to Michael. Without him.
No, absolutely love that. And speaking about celebrating the positives, then I love the story of the cleaner and trying to coax him into telling him his story. And I'm pretty sure that most marketers in the history of their careers probably have had to have that uncomfortable conversation with one of these colleagues and saying, we just need to take a photograph of you, and then would you mind doing a bit of video and stuff like that. I mean, like, has there ever been like a, you know, I mean, do you guys have a process for it, or is it literally like wandering up to someone and saying, we think you're amazing, do you mind if we record you?
There's a bit of both, really, a bit of both. We have those people who are very proactive, and they will let us know that their teams are doing amazing things, and we'll go and capture that. But equally, that BBC piece was very much about finding those stories, and it was putting a journalist hat on actually and going out and finding them. And he was one of the ones. Give one word answers, and you're like, come on, give us a little bit more, please. You've got an amazing story behind this. But it's a balance between going out and finding them, and often we've tried to empower a culture of teams having their own sort of Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts where it makes sense, or with, there's a process behind it. But often we find stories from them as well, because we can't be everywhere. 170 department, 11,000 staff, we'll never be able to find absolutely everything. So it's about the relationship building behind the scenes as well, to know where those real nuggets are.
That's great. And I love that, but you are spot on that that's a really difficult task to understand, because you're going to be getting messages from up above, which is, we need to be speaking about the guidelines and stuff like that, but you're also seeking it from down below. So do you guys have I don't want to say like a process, but do you have like a conscious act of listening where you're like, okay, we need to get, how are we going to capture the zeitgeist of the sort of like on the ground stuff right now? Do you have a process for that, or is it just you kind of feel it out over the course of time?
I suppose so some of us are on site some of the time. So when I'm on site, I like to go and talk to people. What's the feeling? What's happening with staff? And actually, the Facebook group is brilliant for that, because you'll put something up and you'll get a whole host of responses about what's going on. So, for example, car parking is a big deal. Previously, people had to pay for it, but since March, it's been free for all NHS staff. And people are really worried about that, because it's given them a bit more freedom. Otherwise, they'd have had to have gone to one of the park and rides and made their way in. So it gives them back a little bit of time. So these are real important things. So if we weren't listening, we wouldn't know what those were, because when leaders are pitching their, I suppose, what's happening, what's going to happen for the next 3 to 6 months, if we're not addressing those messages, then it doesn't land in the way that you need it to, because you're not talking to the points that people know are really important to them. So car parking is a big part of our messaging, actually.
Absolutely. And, you know, I can speak to that personally, you know, so I'm doing a few trips to the hospital myself at the moment, but so is my wife, and you know, she sort of speaks about the free car parking. So, you know, it's a very relevant thing. And actually on the point of leadership, so there is a question here from Dave, and I'd be interested as well to add a little bit to it. So the bit that I'd like to add to it is that, you know, Rory Sutherland and many other marketing speakers sort of speak about marketing as the lens of the customer in an organization. You know, so you are able to be sort of like the voice of the customer in the board meeting, go in and sort of represent them. So the first half of the question is, when you go into these leadership meetings, is it your responsibility as part of the communications team to sort of feedback that sort of on the ground stuff and sort of have that responded to by leadership? And then the flip side, which Dave has offered, is how do you get buy-in from leadership when proposing content or self-moderated content, particularly in a health setting?
So to the first point, we reflect the voice not only of patients but of staff as well. So that's a really important part of it. So I don't sit on the board. My boss, Ali Bailey, who's just an amazing comms director, she does that role, and she does it very well, making sure that patients and staff are at the heart of things, because often you have to reflect it back, and knowing, and only if you've done that listening piece can you do that well. So it's absolutely, it ties into the previous question. By having that intelligence of what's going on in the organisation, only then can you truly reflect that, and make people be reflective on it. And it is our job to help people understand how things will land. Something that we've recently been doing is I've set up a communications diversity review panel, which has representation across the trust and patients too. People who are BAME, LGBT, absolutely anybody who perhaps might have a different view, and messaging might land with a little bit differently, because we just don't know until we test these things. So I've been using that as a kind of a bouncing critical friend for us for a lot of communications. So for example, we're running our corporate identity refresh and our new tone of voice through them, and they're picking up on things that I just wouldn't have clocked. And unless we do that piece to actually ask people, we won't know. So there's lots of ways that we're trying to incorporate voice into the way that we do things. And there's sometimes that we just can't do that because of the pace at which we need to move. But for our longer term pieces, it's really important that we do that checking in, and then that again that gets reflected back, because if we know that something's an issue, we can say so and say, look, we know that this isn't going to land in the way that we need it to. And so the second point was?
So getting buy-in from leadership when proposing sort of, you know, fast-paced content and self-moderated content too.
Sure. So for that, I think that's built up over time with confidence. So the response that we've had to COVID has built a lot of trust, a lot of confidence with senior leaders. And the more that we do things like the Facebook Lives and giving people a platform to share their views and then have people interact with them, and it's not just this one-way conversation, it's truly two-way, it builds confidence. So then when we want to suggest something a little bit off the wall, then we've done that hard work behind the scenes to build that trust and confidence. And to be honest, they just let us crack on now, which is great. I mean, what a privileged position to be in as a team. So we'll float ideas, we'll say this is what we're going to be doing, part in it really. That's a really nice position.
That, you know, that is something that Dave Gerhardt touched on yesterday, which is, you know, sometimes experience just counts, you know, and whether that's experience of working together or experience of knowing what's going to land in that moment and just going and doing it. You know, sometimes you earn that right over doing something for a number of years, and of course you put the checks and balances in, but you know, the flip side is that sometimes you just need to do something. It's amazing to have that trust, and it's no surprise you've earned it though, to be fair as well, Sarah. So you know, good on you. Rich, I'm out of questions, my friend. How are you for questions?
I haven't got anything else to say other than, like, one of the themes that you started talking about, like when we were I haven't got anything else to say, but so one of the things that you were talking about before that like really resonated for me. So like, again, in the like the B2B space that we typically work in, we hear a lot, and I think it's probably one of those in vogue statements that you hear, particularly from SaaS and tech companies, is that voice of the customer. So everybody is focused on the customer, like what are their needs in this, like how are we addressing those needs, that kind of thing. And I think what's really interesting about what you've presented to us is the flipping of that. So we talk about ourselves being a team first agency, but I think quite often one of the areas that we fall down with, particularly in our marketing and our communications, external and internal, is having that voice of the team. And I think like I was talking to like in one of the comments, I think Renee brought it up, is is having like is people buy from people, and making that like the team the center of your messaging, and making sure that messaging is resonating with your team, not just the customer, I think is an incredibly powerful message that we can take from that in kind of into the B2B sector as well.
That's great. It's because it comes down to what do you need people to do? How do you need to influence people to do that? So what do you need them to think, feel, do? And that comes across for anybody. Is it your own actual communications team? Is it the wider team as a whole? So I think that applies across the board. And it really is interesting doing marketing in a public sector environment, because there's so much that can be applied, but you really feel like you are keeping the human at the very, very centre, because that's naturally what you're there to do. So it's a really unique role as a head of digital communications, and it's about that digital patient experience, and something that we've just delivered the brand new COH website, which just I'm in awe of, because
It looks great. It looks great as well.
it hasn't changed. And so, you know, as much as it hasn't got everything, there was 13,000 pages, you know, getting through all that rich content, can't keep everything, but there's so much that could be done from from transitioning from digital into the real life, because we know that wayfinding for our patients is really big, because the hospital is like a rabbit warren. So how can we as a team then look at that? So, you know, what digitally could we do that enables people to get around the hospital easier, using devices that transition from the real world into digital? So,
it must be such an interesting position to be in. So because like when I think of NHS and digital, like the thoughts that immediately come to mind are like the shitty websites that the medical practice use and things like that. I think it must be such an exciting proposition to be able to see so much of like the potential there, like, and how that stuff could be made better. I'm aware there's also the kind of the red tape, the budgets, all of that kind of stuff that comes with the public sector. So I think, like, how do you balance that excitement but frustration, or is that frustration kind of not there? Am I just imagining that piece?
I think, I mean, we've been really lucky to have the funding that we did. We were able to do a lot of user discovery to understand what is important to people. So we have been very fortunate with the budgets, so that hasn't been an issue. I think long term it potentially will, but the whole piece was about September came into force the new public sector accessibility regulations. So by law, as a public sector organisation, you have to have accessible websites, you have to have accessible intranets, and if you don't, you need to have a plan of action that shows that you are actually working on it and not just paying heed to it. So yeah, it is difficult, but we also have our charity, Adam and Brooks Charitable Trust, who have an innovation fund. So that's what I'd like to be looking at if funds perhaps in the organisation don't allow the next step of all this. And there's a lot that you can do collaboratively with organisations. So now that we've got our platform, we can look at how to maximise that in a way that perhaps we could do without a budget. So there's so much, even just from a content point of view, thinking, well, actually some of the stuff just doesn't work for patients. What can we do as a team to work on that? So there's creative ways we can do it with and without money.
Does your role touch on the kind of the out of hospital digital elements? So like the remote GP stuff, or like the remote communication with the external patients, because obviously like a lot of people are being asked to stay at home, so that's becoming more and more prevalent. Does your role touch on any of that?
not so much. We make sure the interfacing between the bigger communications, like the website, that works and that's in place.
Yep.
So there are so the IT team mainly deal with that. So we have something called My Chart, which is I mean, I'm in awe of the team because they've just hit the HIMSS, which is level 7, which is it's the top level for hospitals to have in terms of digital. So in terms of the integration of everything, so your healthcare record, we have barcode scanners so that so patients will wear a barcode wristband, and you scan that to make sure that the medication that you're giving is the right medication. So there's so much about the organisation that's digital that my role doesn't really touch on. It's mainly about the reputational stuff and website, intranet, social media. That's the biggest thrust of my role.
Nice. Well, I think I speak for Joe and me. Like, it's an incredible way to start the day 2, and such a powerful story. And one of the comments, so Leslie made a comment say like it's great to see a marketer talking about internal comms, because quite often either as marketers we forget about internal comms, or we never see the impact of them. So like when I think internal comms, quite often we're talking about like some notification emails, like a message from our CEO, like that kind of crap that just gets pumped out in large organizations. And it's good for, as marketers, to be able to see the impact that internal comms can have on an organization, because that internal comms inevitably filters out into the external presence of the, or kind of presence of the business.
Well, 11,000 ambassadors who, armed with the right information, can be quite powerful. And it's people, how many of those are patients? So actively receiving care from our hospitals. So they kind of a dual role of patient and staff. So yeah, I do feel that they are your biggest advocates, and if keep them happy, keep them informed. Very, very powerful.
Amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much. Like, you know, I think I'm going to spend the rest of the day quite contemplative, but in the most positive of ways, and it's kind of your fault, but in a really good way as well. So, thank you so much for that, and just absolutely outstanding. I think I want to work for the NHS now. So,
We do. I mean, there's so much about it that's just amazing, and I do often think, maybe one day I'll head into the private sector, but it gets your claws in.
I don't know. I think you seem to be pretty blooming amazing where you are. So I think we're all grateful. But with all that said, I think we should allow you to do some very important work. So thank you very much, Sarah, for taking the time. Thank you, everyone, for watching this morning. Our next session is when, Rich?
2 p.m. with Julie Hogan.
Fabulous. So 2 p.m. We'll see you all there. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks again, Sarah.
Bye.
Everyone.